The Great Stillness, when the Earth shook off its spin. Chapter 1. The Drift in the Data. The basement of the Denver Federal Center was perpetually chilly, a fact John usually appreciated. It kept the servers hummed at a stable temperature and the coffee in his mug from cooling too quickly. But today, the chill felt different, sharper, like a warning. John Mercer was a man who lived by the predictable physics of the Earth. As a senior geophysicist for the USCs, he spent his days tracking the geomagnetic North Pole, a point that had been wandering lazily from the Canadian Arctic toward Siberia for decades. It was a slow, geological stroll. Until this morning. "That can't be right," John muttered, leaning so close to his monitor that the blue light reflected in his thick glasses. He refreshed the feed from the intermagnet sensors. Then he ran a diagnostic on the Mag-03 magnetometer in Boulder. The data remained stubbornly consistent. The wandering had turned into a sprint. The numbers don't lie under normal circumstances. The pole moved at a rate of roughly 55 kilometers per year. It was a brisk pace for a planet, but manageable for navigation systems. John stared at the scrolling telemetry. In the last 24 hours, the magnetic north had lurched nearly 4 kilometers. If the math held, the Earth wasn't just wobbling, it was prepping for a somersault. "If this is a sensor glitch, I'm fired for the heart attack I'm about to have," John whispered to the empty room. "If it isn't, we're all in a lot more trouble than a lost job." A quiet premonition, he stood up, his knees popping in the silence of the lab. He walked over to a small bowl of paper clips on his desk. He took a high-end magnetized needle, suspended it by a silk thread, and watched. The needle didn't just point north. It vibrated. It shivered with a frantic, microscopic energy, as if the very fabric of the planet's core was boiling. Outside his window, the Denver sky was a bruised purple. A flock of migratory birds passed by, but they weren't flying in their usual V formation. They were chaotic, circling aimlessly, crashing into the glass of the neighboring building as their internal biological compasses began to spin. John grabbed his coat and his laptop. He didn't call his boss, he called his ex-wife. "Sarah, pick up the kids from school. Now. Don't ask questions, just get to the high ground in the foothills. I'll meet you there in an hour." He didn't wait for her reply. He knew that if the magnetic field was collapsing this fast, the crustal displacement wouldn't be far behind. The Earth was about to shrug, and humanity was just dust on its shoulders. Chapter 2. The Momentum of a Dying Spin. The drive to the foothills was a nightmare of stalled cars and panicked pedestrians. John's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. On the passenger seat, his laptop was still tethered to the US mainframe, screaming out data points that defied every textbook in his office. The magnetic excursion had reached a critical threshold. As the poles flipped, the magnetohydrodynamic engine of the Earth's outer core, the swirling liquid iron that generates our magnetic field, had hit a catastrophic turbulence. It was no longer just a shift in polarity, it was a physical braking mechanism. The physics of the stall. John knew the terrifying math. The Earth rotates at roughly 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. This rotation creates a bulge. The planet isn't a perfect sphere, but an oblate spheroid. "Newton's first law," John muttered, glancing at the darkening horizon. "Objects in motion stay in motion." If the magnetic core's upheaval caused the lithosphere, the Earth's crust, to decouple and stall against the mantle, the planet's solid surface would grind toward a halt. But the atmosphere and the oceans were not bolted down. They possessed the same 1,000 mph momentum. The great wind, as the ground slowed, the air would keep screaming eastward at supersonic speeds. It wouldn't just be a storm, it would be a planetary pressure wash, scouring buildings, forests, and topsail off the bedrock. The slosh, the oceans, currently held in place by centrifugal force at the equator, would suddenly find themselves on a stationary ball. Without the spin to keep them heaped at the middle, the water would migrate violently toward the new gravitational and rotational equilibrium. Echoes of the deep past John flashed back to his graduate thesis on the Younger Dryas and the various flood myths found in every culture from the Sumerians to the Maya. For years, academia had dismissed the Great Flood as allegory or localized river flooding. But John knew the truth now. This wasn't the first time. The geologic record was littered with erratic massive boulders moved hundreds of miles by water that shouldn't have been there. It's a cycle, John realized, a cold sweat breaking on his brow. The poles flip, the crust slips, and the world gets a hard reset. The Great Flood wasn't a miracle, it was a tidal surge 3 miles high. The first signs, the car suddenly jerked to the left. It wasn't the steering, it was the wind. A low, guttural howl began to build, a sound like 1,000 freight trains approaching from the west. The sky didn't just turn dark, it turned a bruised, sickly green. He looked at his GPS. The coordinates were flickering wildly. The north it was searching for no longer existed in a fixed location. "Come on, Sarah," he whispered, slamming his foot on the gas. "Get higher. The water is coming." Chapter 3: The Wall of Silence. The road into the foothills of the Rockies was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles. John's SUV roared over the shoulder, kicking up gravel as he bypassed a jackknifed semi-truck. The air felt heavy, charged with static that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Every radio station was a blizzard of white noise, and the cellular towers had finally succumbed to the massive electromagnetic pulse rippling through the atmosphere. He saw her car, the silver minivan, parked haphazardly near a trailhead at an elevation of 8,500 feet. Sarah was standing outside, clutching their 2 children, Leo and Maya. They were looking at the sky. It wasn't blue anymore. It was a shimmering, iridescent veil of violet and crimson. The auroras, usually confined to the frozen latitudes of the north, were now dancing over Colorado, a beautiful omen of the collapsing magnetic shield. "John!" Sarah screamed over a rising hum. "What is happening?" "The compass on the dashboard is just spinning." "Get in the car. We need to get behind the rock face," John yelled, ushering them toward a narrow granite overhang he had scouted years ago during a survey. The shockwave as they scrambled into the shallow cave, the world went terrifyingly silent. The birds had stopped screaming. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath for one heartbeat. Then the atmospheric shockwave arrived. Because the Earth's crust was slowing while the air mass was not, the transition created a supersonic shear layer. A wall of pressure hit the mountainside with the force of a nuclear blast. John tackled his family to the dirt, shielding them with his body as the great wind began. The sound was no longer a howl, it was a physical weight. Massive Duggar's furs were snapped like toothpicks, not blown over but shattered into splinters. Above them, the sky turned into a blur of brown and grey as the topsail of the Great Plains was vacuumed into the sky and hurled eastward at nearly 800 miles per hour. The rising tide. John checked his ruggedized watch, which contained an internal altimeter. The pressure readings were swinging so wildly the digital display was a blur. "We're high enough for the wind," Sarah gasped, her face covered in dust. But you said the oceans, John. We're 1,000 miles from the coast. It doesn't matter, John said, his voice grim. He pulled up a topographical map on his laptop, which was powered by a dying battery. The Pacific isn't just going to rise. When the planet stops spinning, the equatorial bulge, the water that's piled up 20 kilometers high at the center of the Earth, is going to flatten. It's a global slosh. He pointed to the screen. The water would rush toward the poles, then rebound. The sheer volume of the Pacific and Atlantic would overtop the continental divide. The California coast is already gone, John whispered. The Central Valley is a lake. We have maybe 4 hours before the surge hits the western slopes of these mountains. The water is coming from both sides, Sarah. We're on an island now. Suddenly, the ground beneath them groaned. A deep tectonic vibration shook the granite. The crust wasn't just slowing down, it was cracking. Chapter 4: The Sound of the Deep. The supersonic winds had settled into a steady, deafening roar, but a new sound began to emerge from the darkness of the west, a low-frequency thrum that John felt in his marrow before he heard it with his ears. It was the sound of 1 trillion tons of salt water pulverizing everything in its path. The Pacific, John breathed, checking his watch. It was ahead of schedule. The Earth's deceleration was more jagged than his models had predicted, causing the slosh to hit with the violence of a whip crack. The inundation from their vantage point high on the granite spine of the Rockies, they watched the unthinkable. To the west, the horizon didn't just contain clouds, it was a solid, shimmering wall of white and slate gray. The water, having already swallowed the Sierra Nevadas and the Great Basin, was climbing the western slopes of the Rockies. Look. Leo pointed, his voice trembling. In the valley below, the light of the auroras reflected off a rising tide of debris. It wasn't just water, it was a slurry of pulverized cities, ancient forests, and the salt-caked remains of the desert floor. The surge was climbing. The hydrostatic trap, we have to move higher. John shouted, grabbing their emergency pack. The overhang won't hold if the water creates a hydrostatic vacuum. It'll suck the roof right off this cave. They began a desperate scramble upward. The air was thinning, not just because of the altitude, but because the atmosphere itself was being redistributed toward the poles along with the water. Every breath felt like sucking through a straw. Sarah slipped, her boots losing grip on the wet lichen. John caught her, hauling her up just as a spray of salt water, bitter and cold, blasted over the ridge below them. Salt water in the middle of Colorado. The reality of it was a physical blow. The rebound as they reached a narrow plateau near the summit, John looked east toward the Great Plains. The sight was even worse. The Atlantic surge, having crossed the Appalachians, was meeting the Pacific surge right over the heart of the continent. The two greatest bodies of water on Earth were colliding in a titanic standing wave. It's the meeting of the seas, John whispered, shielding his eyes from the spray. The same event recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The world isn't ending, it's just being washed clean. The ground gave a final, violent lurch as the crust finally settled into its new, non-rotating position. The sun, which should have been setting, seemed to hang frozen in the sky, a bloated red orb trapped on the horizon. They huddled together on the peak, a tiny island of humanity in a world that was now 70% white foam and 30% jagged mountain peaks. The great silence returned, broken only by the lapping of the new global ocean against the ancient stone of the Rockies. Chapter 5: The Eternal Twilight. The world was no longer a sphere of motion, it was a cathedral of ice and stillness. As the Earth's rotation hit its final, shuddering equilibrium, the sun remained pinned against the western horizon like a jagged gold coin. In this new reality, one half of the world was destined for a slow, scorching bake, while the other would descend into a permanent, frozen night. John, Sarah, and the children sat on the narrow spine of the peak, huddling under a thermal mylar blanket. They were survivors on the highest point of a new, jagged archipelago. The new map below them, the Denver they knew, was gone. There were no lights, no grids, no humming highways. In its place was a vast, inland sea, the water choked with a thick soup of pulverized civilization. "The sun," Maya whispered, her face pale. "Why isn't it moving?" "The Earth has stopped turning, honey," John said, his voice raspy from the salt air. "For us, the sun will stay right there. We're in the twilight zone, the narrow strip between the side of the Earth that faces the sun and the side that faces the stars." He looked at his compass. The needle was dead, pointing limply toward the ground. The poles had completed their flip, and the magnetic field was beginning to re-establish itself, but the geography of the planet had been rewritten. A history scrubbed clean. John looked out over the endless water. He thought of the Sphinx with its water erosion patterns that geologists had argued over for decades. He thought of the Peary Rise map showing an ice-free Antarctica. "We always wondered how the ancients knew things they shouldn't," John mused. "They didn't discover it. They were the survivors of the last shift. They were the ones who sat on peaks like this, watching the water recede, waiting to start over. The survival of the few. They weren't alone." As the mist cleared, John saw tiny flickers of light on distant peaks: Long's Peak, Pike's Peak, Mount Evans. Other survivors were signaling with mirrors and emergency flares. The human spirit, much like the planet itself, was stubborn. The great slosh was beginning to drain toward the new poles, but the world would never return to its old shape. The oceans were deeper now, the air thinner, and the rhythm of day and night was a relic of a lost era. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, looking at the meager supplies in their pack. John looked at his children, then back at the frozen sun. "We do what they did 10,000 years ago. We wait for the ground to dry. We find the others. And we start writing the next story." Chapter 6: The Age of the Sunseekers. 12 years after the shift, the village of New Meridian clung to the eastern slope of what used to be called the Front Range. It wasn't built of steel and glass, but of salvaged stone, hardened clay, and the repurposed hulls of ships that had been deposited thousands of feet above sea level by the Great Slosh. John Mercer stood on the terrace of the community's solar distillery, his skin a deep, weathered bronze. In a world without a day-night cycle, time was measured by the long shadows. The sun remained perpetually fixed at a 30-degree angle above the western peaks, a bloated, orange orb that never set, casting an eternal, amber afternoon over the settlement. The twilight civilization to the west lay the Scorch, the half of the world locked in permanent sunlight where the heat was becoming unbearable. To the east, beyond the reach of the Rockies' protective shadow, lay the Grip, a frozen wasteland of endless night. Humanity now lived in the narrow, habitable ring of life, where the temperature was moderated by the massive, new inland seas. Agriculture: they grew shade crops on the eastern slopes and sun crops on the western, rotating laborers instead of seasons. Navigation: stars were only visible to those who journeyed into the Grip, making the stargazers a priestly class of navigators and mappers. The archives: John's primary task was overseeing the Great Lithic Wall, where he and other scholars carved the history of the 21st century into the granite. They used simplified symbols, knowing that in a few generations, English might be as dead as Latin. a legacy in stone. Leo, now a man of 20, approached his father with a satchel of salt-crusted artifacts found at the new shoreline, 500 feet below the village. The water receded another inch this month, Dad, Leo said, laying out a rusted, unrecognizable piece of machinery. The old world is coming up for air. John picked up the relic, a distorted piece of a satellite dish. He looked at it, then at the sky where the moon now traced a strange, wobbling path through the static-charged atmosphere. The water always recedes eventually, John said softly. And every time it does, we think we're the first ones to walk the earth. But we aren't. We're just the ones who remembered to climb. The new cycle. Sarah emerged from the communal kitchen, calling the village to the mid-shift meal. There were no clocks, only the rhythmic tolling of a bell made from a salvaged oxygen tank. John looked out over the sparkling expanse of the Colorado Sea. He knew that deep beneath those waters lay the ruins of the world he had once complained about: the traffic, the bills, the digital noise. It all seemed like a fever dream now. The poles would stay fixed for another few thousand years. The Earth would remain still. And humanity, as it always did, would adapt to the new physics of its home. They were no longer citizens of a nation, they were the stewards of a quiet, golden world. Keep the record clear, Leo, John said, handing the relic back. Tell them why the world stopped. So the next time the needle starts to shiver, they'll know to look to the mountains. The end.